Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me again. My name is Karl Hughes, as you probably know, just from the name and my artist field in the podcast. Today with me, I've got Tony Wilson, my good friend who runs Accquip Financial. Tony, give us the quick rundown on Accquip and what you guys do.
Accquip is a fractional CFO and accounting service provider, and we exist to help digital agency owners grow the businesses that they love without going bankrupt in the process. That's kind of our little snippet.
None of us want to go bankrupt. I literally just this week, and this is not funny, it's not good, it just is life, right? As an entrepreneur, I just found out about a competitor. I've met the founder several times. I mean, people I know well, basically running out of money, like going bankrupt. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned when you hear those stories, I will say. That said, it is brutal. And person to person would never want to go through that, never want to have somebody I know go through that. Let's talk about it though, because it's a hard topic to talk about because it sucks and it's scary. What happens, then this is kind of a broad question that will get us into what we're going to talk about, I think. What happens for a company to go bankrupt?
Well, I think what it starts with oftentimes is pipeline. It all comes down to pipeline when it comes to agency growth. It's the both the curse and the blessing of agency model, where it's simultaneously the simplest type of business model to have, but then also is super incredibly complex because if you're not addressing your pipeline issues, everything else kind of falls apart. So what I see happen is you have this kind of stagnation in the pipeline, but because there's not visibility and there's not eyes on what's happening in your pipeline, you might be doing great for a couple months. But you don't have insight into what's coming down the pipeline, even 6 months down the road. So you're not making many good decisions with the money that you do have right now, right? So you might be thinking, oh, now's the time to hire because we're really busy right now. Or you might be making more reactive decisions in that mode. So I think it all stems from a lack of visibility on pipeline and understanding what's going on, and also driving revenue growth in the pipeline. And then, a couple months down the road, after things start to kind of fall apart, one thing leads to another. Maybe it's you're starting to try to sell things at a lower price point so that you can get more volume in the door, which just then leads to this downward spiral of like lowering gross margins. And then before you know it, you can't make payroll. So,
yep. Yeah, I've seen a few things and it really echoes what you're saying here. It's like, pipeline is, let's say, starting point is zero for everything. The founder goes out and they get some business. And so there's their pipeline. And then they start to spend all their time servicing that business. They stop doing any business development work. And so the pipeline kind of just dries up to a nothing. Now, in the early days, when you're the only person working on the business, that feast, famine, cycle, it's not pleasant, but it's like manageable because your costs are so low. It's just you. So like you can survive it. But where I see it becoming a problem, and you can kind of tell me the same thing if you see that, is when you've got a team of 10 that you've committed to keeping on your team, or you've got them in W-2 people because their jobs are hard to replace, or even if you have lots of contractors that are a little more flexible, they still are there's some fixed overhead and there's costs in training people. So you can't just ramp people up instantly. And so what happens is you get real busy. And so the founder stops the new business development. They go into execution mode. They're hiring, they're operating, they're doing this. And then all of a sudden they realize 6 months later, oh, there's no more pipeline. We just serviced all the work we had. Anyway, I see that so often. It's such a huge challenge for agencies. What do we do to stop it, Tony? I'm going to open it up. This is the $1 million plus question here.
Well, I wish I had a silver bullet. I don't know that I have a silver bullet, but from a fractional CFO's perspective, one of the things that I'm always talking with my clients about is, because we look at this every single month, we look at what is the percentage of your total revenue that you're spending on sales and marketing. And the way that we do it too, we take a pretty comprehensive approach. So we're not just a fractional CFO, we're a fractional CFO plus your accounting. So it's all in one, because for agencies that's really what you need. But what we're trying to do is we're also trying to reflect financially the time investment that goes into your sales and marketing efforts, right? Because you've seen more than enough agencies. You and I both have seen more than enough agencies to see that it's very rare until you get to maybe 5 or 6 million plus. Very rare to see one person dedicated to one type of function in the agency. most of the time you're wearing multiple hats, especially as the founder, right? Like you gave a great example. It's like, but in those early years, you're probably doing a little bit of client service delivery. You're doing a little bit of sales and marketing. You're doing a little bit of general administrative. And so I think the first step is really kind of parsing out, okay, if you're spending half of your time on sales and marketing, let's reflect that financially so that when we go to calculate how much of our money we're spending, how much of our revenue we're spending on sales and marketing, are we at least on par? Because most of the time what happens is you don't track that. It's not a priority. If it's not tracked, if you can't manage it, you're not going to be able to, maintain that prioritization. And time eventually results in a decline in the amount of time you're spending on sales and marketing.
Yep, absolutely. I think this is encapsulated in so many agencies that I look at, where I look at their, we go through a lot of acquisition work. And so we're looking at their books, and there's no separation of cost of goods sold and operating expenses and sales and marketing. Like, it's just all lumped together. Salaries, $50,000 a month salaries. Like, what the hell is that? I don't know where to break that down. And so the problem there, if you don't have your finances, and so this kind of, I'm going to sort of build a commercial for your work, but really anybody who's doing your kind of work, I think it's essential to these small businesses that are starting to hire people, because you've got to understand, am I actually spending a good percentage of my revenue on future growth, or am I just completely ignoring that future pipeline at the end and looking like net margins are okay. I'm spending all my money on, producing this work for clients and they're happy and all that. But like, that's not the full story, because we've got to build that pipeline. That's a really good insight, Tony. Yeah. So talk to me about what that percentage should be. This is maybe the answer, like to any good question, probably is it depends, but like, how do you start to build some guardrails for yourself?
Yeah. I think the way that I talk with my clients about it is, so in my experience, the typical agency is spending between 3 to 8% of their total revenues. That's when we start talking with them, they're usually spending in that ballpark, 3 to 8%. That's not the way it should be, but I'm saying that's just typically, like, right, exactly. And so usually what'll happen, 9 times out of 10, we'll work with them. We'll put a spotlight on here, and I'll say, look, one of the issues of why your pipeline is so inconsistent or completely dry is because you don't even have a go-to-market strategy foundation, right? There's not that foundation that's been laid. So what I say is, when we're starting to work together, we're coming to this recognition, like, oh crap, what we've been doing in the past with just like word of mouth referrals is not going to get us to the next place. I say, okay, we now need to prioritize, in like this phase 1, we need to up that to like 15 to 20%. Which people hear that and they're like, holy crap, that's a lot. That's a lot to spend. But one thing I want to have people keep in mind is that 15 to 20% is inclusive of the time it's taking, your time as an owner and a founder. And 60 to 70% of your overall sales and marketing spend is going to be labor related. So it's really not, we're not saying like go spend 15 to 20% on hiring a fractional CMO or hire, some ad agency. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you're going to have to spend a decent amount of your time here, but 15 to 20% to start with. And then I think once you've really dialed in, you've established a really solid foundation, you know who your ICP is, and you have effective messaging to those people, you can start to ratchet that spend down a little bit. But I'd say a healthy spend is probably still going to maintain around 10 to 15%.
Yep. Yeah. I think those numbers would echo what I've seen too from the agencies that really make it long-term and continue to have growth, but not only growth, but like growth that they can kind of control. And look, at the end of the day, like it's very hard to control growth because there's so many market forces outside of our control, but at least having a steady deal flow, no matter the ups and downs of the market, is huge. So I'll give you another personal example, because I just saw this in the last couple of years with one of our agencies. So Draft.dev works in a super niche agency. We work in developer relations, developer marketing. That field 2 years ago was gangbusters. Nobody could spend money fast enough. There were agencies like us popping up all over the place. Everybody had tons of huge budgets. We were in this massive growth trajectory, right? It was easy to get clients. And so the problem when it's easy to get clients is a lot of people in our space just stopped spending money on marketing. They stopped doing the content. They stopped going to events. They just serviced clients. Fine. They survived, right? The good times. But inevitably, interest rates go up, VC money goes down. This industry is really hard hit because of AI. Lots of things happen all at once. And it's now a really tight market. So Draft.dev has survived because we continue to invest in content marketing and the sales stuff that works for us over that time, like continue spending a pretty disciplined 15-20% of revenue on that stuff. Whereas about half of our big competitors are just gone now. And so crazy to see that in a market, but like it's, again, it comes back to just like the discipline, I think is what you're talking about, of like looking at your finances and saying, I'm going to, even when times are good, I'm going to spend the money on these long-term things that will pay off when.
And and I think just to call attention to this, because I'm sure this is going through people's minds as they listen to this episode, is they're thinking, okay, that's all well and good when you are doing well and you have money, but I've had conversations. One of my clients in particular, they're having a rough time. I think there's a lot of challenge in kind of coming into a kind of a recovery state out of the 2023 and 2024 we've had. So they're still in kind of just a strapped position, and so they look at their bank balance and they're like, oh, I don't think I can afford to spend this money. And I'm like, no. You literally can't afford not to right now. And so I think it's not only the discipline to maintain that when the times are good, but it's also the discipline to say, this is such an important investment that I'm going to say, even though it seems like I'm facing the edge of a cliff, I still need to be investing in this, or else it's going to get even worse.
Right. Yeah. And again, to your point, I like the idea of thinking about the founder's time could be the big expense, quote unquote, because that is something that you do have a lot more control over. If you can get yourself out of most of the client, production and actual client work, then you've got this variable sort of lever you can move of like, how much of my time do I spend on sales marketing? It could be 50, 60, 75% of your time when, things are tighter and you don't have the cash. But I think that's certainly a good option. And honestly, you know this, like for every hour of founder time spent, it's usually worth several hours of other people's time because we tend to just know our business so well.
That's right. That. Yeah, the ins and outs. One thing else that you said that I want to kind of underscore here, and I'm really glad that you mentioned it, is successful agencies continue to invest in this. Again, it can feel like this is a lot of money. Like, are we sure we're on the right page? But like, you're a great example of this. You've now acquired multiple agencies. You're running very successful, growing agencies, and you have the discipline, and you are maintaining that investment in your businesses.
Something else I'll say too, and this is going to come into, we're going to talk about this a bit more because you've got a good sort of whole agency valuation blueprint. And I think this is something that, again, a lot of people don't think about, is how much more valuable your agency could be if it didn't just have, we just take whatever referrals come in as the acquisition channel. Because I would say probably something like 75% of the agencies I talk to, again, these are relatively small agencies, but still at least 75%, their main acquisition channel is whatever comes in the door, like referrals, mostly just word of mouth. We do good work. Hey, that's great. Like we all want that. Like that should happen. That's a baseline, I think, just a requirement. If you're doing good work, you're going to get referrals. That said, if that is one and only channel, as a buyer, that is extremely unattractive because that's not something that I can guarantee is going to come along with the company when the founder leaves. And so anyway, again, another thing to think about here is like building up these channels just for the sake, if nothing else, of being able to resiliently either step away and go retire someday or give this thing off to somebody else and sell it, whatever you want to do.
Yeah. And specifically about channels, I think one thing that I also am a big advocate and proponent of, not because I'm like, I love sending cold emails, but I think we need, as agencies, and agency owners, we need to start getting more comfortable with not just all inbound marketing, right? I think like we've been sold a little bit of a lie on LinkedIn, which is to say, if I create content, they will come. And like, I mean, you're laughing because like this. I
mean, sometimes is the answer, right? like, and isn't that I'm 100% with you. I think there's a place for inbound, there's a place for outbound, there's a place for a diversity of channels. That said, there's some kind of like practical limit too. And I'm curious to hear how you think about this because I can't do 20 things. Like I'm not an expert. I don't have the money, whatever. So how do I pick 2 or 3?
That's really, really good. Well, and again, I'm going to speak at it less of a marketer's perspective because I'm not a marketer. I like marketing, but I'm not a marketer. But I will speak to the financial aspect of it. And that is to say, when we think about, I just put myself in the shoes of a lot of the software devs that I work with, because that's like my sub niche, my specialization is software development. And then outside of that, more broadly, it's digital agencies, but software developers in particular. most of the ticket prices we're dealing with software dev agencies are pretty high, right? You talk about customer lifetime value is pretty substantial. So these are like your whales, and some of my clients, like they're working with enterprise level clients that we're talking in the millions of dollars. And so when you're dealing with deal sizes that large, project sizes that large, you can afford a pretty bespoke marketing approach, right? Like literally, you probably, I mean, not to say that you shouldn't have a website, but I'm just saying like you could probably eke by with just having conversations, going to conferences and doing a very high touch kind of approach to your marketing. And then on the very other end of the scale, if you have, much more bite size, a couple $100 a month type of price points, maybe a couple $1,000 a month price points, you might not be able to afford necessarily that high touch of a approach in your marketing strategy. So I think the sliding scale really depends on the type of services you're offering and the types of clients you're reaching.
We're butting up against marketing because I think when we talk about like pipeline and deal flow and all that, you can't avoid that topic. So I'm curious how you deal with this when a client comes to you and you clearly see the problem is pipeline, but they also maybe, like a lot of devs who I'm sure you work with, they're not marketers, right? Like they don't have marketing skills. Do you go tell them here's a fractional marketing person that can kind of help guide you, or do you give them like some playbooks? Like what do you do?
Yep. Well, the first thing I like to do is I like to assess so we say sales and marketing as but they're really two. I mean, sales and marketing are two very distinctive skill sets.
I'll just quickly interrupt you just because somebody just made this comparison to me or made this distinction to me, and it clicked for me. I'm being that I'm slow too. So they were like, is your problem a sales or marketing problem? And I'm always thinking like, yeah, well, we just want to close more deals. Like it's all kind of cohesive. Yes, true. But the question was, is your problem that you don't have enough calls booked on your calendar, or is your problem you have so many calls but you're not closing any of them? Those are the two ways to define. Like, so that first problem is a marketing problem, meaning you need more calls on your calendar. The second problem is more of a sales problem, like you're not closing the calls you have. So a really good way to just understand as an agency owner, like where's my blocker, marketing or sales, and then you can start to talk to experts. But continue, Tony. I apologize for interrupting.
I mean, you touch on exactly what I was going to say there, which is where really is the problem. And in my experience, 9 times out of 10, I actually really think it's a marketing issue. And then 1 time out of 10, I think it's a sales issue. And the reason I say that is this. I think when you need to have good sales skills, you can kind of figure that piece out a little bit. The challenge is when agencies predominantly source their revenue through referrals, they've actually never really sold something, right? And so I think, and the way that I think about sales is just basically like mapping and understanding what it is that is actually the pain that the people are experiencing, and then providing solutions to bring about the transformation. And so, when you're just getting, referrals, that muscle really atrophies. And so the reason I like to start with a good marketing foundation is because if you're doing good marketing foundation, and I would say like product marketing, if we're going to give it a category, is because it can help you to better define like what's in and what's out, and who is it that you're working with. I mean, I don't know about you. I have a very strong opinion about niches and why we need to have more in agency space, especially now that it's become more and more competitive. And
you're preaching to the choir. I love it. Yes, absolutely.
I don't know how agencies grow unless they're just totally fine with taking anything and everything, and then it's all just word of mouth referral.
Yeah, the analogy I've made is that it used to be possible to start the corner agency. So if I lived in a town, I could start the local agency for X creative work, right? And that just doesn't matter anymore. Everything's remote. Nobody is comparing you to people next door to you. They're comparing you to people on the other side of the world. So it's now very hard to stand out as just a local agency. It's very hard to stand out as a generalist agency. We do everything for everyone, especially like you said, when you're early on, you have no reputation, you have no sort of deal flow sources. I'm 100% committed to that. Like first, probably $1 to $5 million needs to be all super niche. And the further niche you can go that has demand, the better you're going to be, and the cheaper your leads are, the cheaper your marketing efforts are, whatever. And so you're 100%, I'm on the same side as you. One thing I find, one more question on this area of like marketing, sales, and finance, because this one is one that a lot of people will ask me about. How do they how do they decide how much to spend on a single effort? So let's say I'm an agency owner and I want to try a couple channels. I've got, let's say, I'm doing my budget. I've got 20K a month to spend on marketing and sales. How do I split that up? What do I do? Do I hire one person? Do I hire a person and spend money on ads? Do I do everything myself for a while? Like, what do you think about there?
I would say it probably depends on the size of the agency. Obviously, if you're above $1 million, you have a little bit more wiggle room there because you'll have a little bit more budget to work with. But my number one caution when it comes to allocating your sales and marketing spend is don't jump too quickly to having somebody do the core fundamental work that you alone need to do, right? Like, especially if we're talking like you're got 700,000, 800,000 in revenue. At that point, I'm a very strong proponent of the founder needs to learn how to do this sales and marketing stuff before they ever hire that person. I think a lot of times we can jump quickly to saying, I'm going to hire that silver bullet person. And maybe this is the first time you're growing, in your agency and you're thinking to yourself, okay, great. I have enough money. Now I can just hire somebody and they're just going to figure it all out. And I can count on 0 fingers how often that has ever worked, right? Like that's never worked.
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, on both, I think the sales and the service delivery side, it's very hard to go hire an external person to figure out the first time problem. And in fact, I would argue that is honestly the only job of the entrepreneur is to come up with the first time what works. And a lot of entrepreneurs, especially again, my background is software engineering, so I know your people who run these dev shops very well. We come into it and think sales and marketing is a problem I will hire for later. It's not really the fundamentals of the business, but I would say that as an entrepreneur, figuring out a sales and marketing plan that kind of works, even if it's not great, just kind of works, is your like day one problem. And from there, service delivery is like, again, you can't just hire for it, but that's a problem you can go solve once you actually have services to deliver. So there's something again, fundamental that I've sort of shifted in the way I think about like business development there that I think a lot of people, I wouldn't have gotten 2 or 3 or, a couple of years before I started. So,
well, one other thing I'll just, cause I think the original question you were asking was about like, how do you even divvy up that budget? A couple things just to kind of like throw out to the audience. So you have it is I typically see like some of those subcategories, probably that, aside from the labor, like your time and anybody else on your team's time, which typically is going to constitute somewhere to the tune of 60 to 75% of your total sales and marketing budget. Then you have some of these other pieces, like maybe we're talking, I think the last time I benchmarked it, it's like anywhere between 5 to 15% of like outsourced labor. So that would be your fractional CMOs, that would be your consultants, those would be, maybe there's a specialist SEO agency that you want to work with to just really hone in on your SEO strategy. There could be a couple different things in kind of that outsourced labor bucket. When it comes to like the tools and the tech that you're using, that's probably anywhere between 2 to 5%, but a lot of times I see like closer to 3%. So yeah, it kind of just slowly goes down from there, but labor is the biggest piece.
Yeah, for sure. Labor is huge. I've always looked at the way I've always framed this is the first thing to get right in a marketing and agency is like your positioning, who is your ideal customer, and getting really, really narrow. Like we said, pick a niche. Somebody, if you're an existing business, then look at your top 5 customers and try to figure out where they all overlap, right? Something like that. But if you're just starting, then it's like make a hypothesis and give it a go. And then there's like start to develop one channel that you already kind of know. So maybe it's just that like you go to meetups and you happen to meet people who are your ideal clients there. Great. Just make it a intentional thing. You're going to go to a meetup every single month. You're going to make, you're going to put these people and start collecting their names, just keeping track of things. And then the next thing I would do is go to like, let's do a second and third channel. Let's try maybe 1 to 2 every 6 months and see what works in 6 months of like committed action to it. Because again, I think one of the big problems people have with marketing is it takes time to show results. So like you said in your SEO case, I could tell you how to build an SEO strategy and start executing on it that would get you ranked within 6 months, but it's not going to happen much faster than that. I mean, again, there's some charlatans that'll tell you it'll be like 2 months, but like reality is we just don't know. Like to get really any understanding of the like critical mass needed, you kind of have to stick with it for a while. You have to iterate a little bit. You have to figure out what's working and not. You have to build a lot of like sort of secondary stuff to make it anyway. So and then just every year, like look at one new channel. What's one new channel we could try and see if it works. And if it's worth it, we'll keep going. If it's not, we'll back off it. And being really intentional with those experiments and thinking long term, to me, that's always been the way that it's worked for me. I'm sure every business is different, but it's like you got to find some pattern that works for you, no matter who you are. Tony, I want to switch gears here because you have a whole resource for this, and this is kind of like, let's assume you didn't go bankrupt. You want to someday sell your business or step away and make it passive. I think for a lot of software developers, especially who start businesses, we think about like, I'd love to make a passive business, like passive income, right? It's like the freaking dream. I think it's kind of maybe never really passive because agencies are constantly serving a market that is changing and there's always got to be some strategic direction there. But even so, like, how do you improve a business to the point where you could step away, you could sell it, or you could, treat this thing as a real asset versus just a thing that I'm, a job for me?
Man, there's so many different angles I would take on this. And I see in your background, for people who are just listening, you can't see it, but I see it. I see your traction book there. And so I think, systems like that, management systems, I cannot stress enough the importance of, and it doesn't have to be EOS. It could be something else. There's lots of, I think, System and Soul. Is it System and Soul? Fire and Soul? Something like that. Anyway, there's a couple other systems that are out there that are similar to it. But at the end of the day, some type of management operating system is so critical because if you guys have not heard this before, I'll just kind of say what everybody is saying, which is in order for you to be able to step away from a business with a relatively decent multiple, it needs to be owner independent, right? Like it needs to be a cash flowing machine that somebody else can buy that is relatively low risk. So there's some other factors, like risk factors, that we want to look at to minimize. And that's the name of the game when it talks about selling a business. It's all about risk mitigation, as well as revenue growth. You get those two things coupled together, you're in a good spot. So some of the risk mitigating factors are things like, what's your customer concentration risk look like, right? And for everybody who doesn't know, if a customer is more than 10% of your revenue, it is technically considered a customer concentration risk. So customer concentration risk is one of them. We want to talk about like, what's your employee base look like? A couple other things we're thinking about are things like, do you have any proprietary tech? Right, because that's a way to kind of create a moat of like value for the agency that you're building. There's a number of other risk.
Quality of revenue comes up a lot, which is this is a term that I hadn't heard until I got into like the more of the private equity people talk about this more. So it's kind of like quality of earnings stuff. So but basically the idea is like, how sticky is your revenue and how like likely is it to stick around when I buy this company? So, you may have long-term contracts. That's one way to improve it. Or you may have more of a subscription model where everybody just kind of by default stays subscribed. Or you might have just an operating history of, I've never lost a client in 5 years. And that could show that you're not likely to lose one in the next 5 years. So there are lots of ways to deal with that. But that's another good one that I think a lot of buyers will look for too.
Totally. And as you're saying that, one of the things, it is a ratio that actually Alex Hormozy talks about. So you probably heard of LTV to CAC. In the agency space, it's probably better termed LTGP, or lifetime gross profit, to CAC, your customer acquisition cost. And so really kind of dialing that in, we're talking about sales and marketing. And part of the reason why I'm so bullish on invest a decent amount of money at the front end, because the more you spend up front, the better you can tailor your systems to acquire customers at a lower and lower cost. So if you can acquire them for really affordable, and your LTGP continues to grow because you're offering higher value services at a lower cost, you've now, again, you've set yourself up for a much more valuable agency model for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So when people think like, okay, I might want to get out of this someday, what's the sort of like checklist of things that they can kind of start to evaluate for themselves? Is there 5 or 6 things that are kind of top of your list?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we had just covered, I would say probably the first piece would be that they need to have a leadership team around them. But people who you're not just the one calling all the shots. These people are relatively capable of continuing the business. Like a good litmus test is, can you take a vacation and things still continue to run?
I
Right.
love that. I think one of the first goals I set for myself, even before I started setting revenue goals, was I want to be able to take a week off and then 2 weeks off at a time without checking email, doing a call, nothing related to the business, and have it still run. And like I'd gradually have increased that amount of time, and eventually you get to a point where you can. I was literally gone for a month when one of my kids was born, and huge to have people that help run it, but kind of to your point, Tony, like it's not just having a person there who's your backup. It's having like very well defined roles where they all know what they're responsible for. You're not going to train like Karl's, co-CEO. That's really tough. I mean, maybe you can get there, but like that's not the real goal. The real goal should be kind of training an individual to take over each of my strengths, and kind of be my backup for each of those areas.
That's right. Well, and I think even like, I can't remember if it was Traction that talks about this. There's a number of different management books that talk about this, but like starting with the question of who is so important. Like, who do you need to have on the bus? And which is why I say, let's start with, what does your leadership team look like? Because even if, you might have a rock solid marketing plan or a rock solid strategy for whatever, but if you don't have the people who are aligned to that strategy and see it the same way that you do, all you're doing is you're just creating more friction down the road. So you always want to start off with that leadership dynamic first. Once you have those people that you feel really, like, I know these people have got my back. I know that we're going to be able to go places, even if they're not a fully developed leadership team, but these are the people that you want to have with you. Then I would say a big part of it probably is making sure that you have very solid marketing foundations. And I would say, like you were talking about, you should be able to clearly identify who's your ICP. You should be able to say, what are those pains that they're experiencing? What's the offer and how are you positioning that offer? That would be another huge piece. I would say, probably very difficult to sell an agency for decent money if you don't have any of that well articulated.
Yeah, the ones that you see. So I'll put some hard numbers around this, and you can kind of back me up where you've seen, if you've seen anything different or the same. When you see a small agency, say under 5 million in revenue, typically your multiples are going to be between. It could be 1 or 2 times SDE, which is seller's discretionary earnings, which basically means your net profit plus what you pay yourself. So it could be 1 or 2 times for the really highly consultative ones that still require that founder to go out to every client call, like super hard to get out of those. And I will say also the other big factor in this is likely those businesses have much longer earnouts, or in other words, periods where the founder is going to need to hang around and work in the business to help with the handoff. So that's on the one extreme. On the other extreme, the very productized, highly niche companies where the founder doesn't work much in the business. They're only doing maybe like high level strategy, and they've got salespeople, they've got marketing going, they've got teams that do all the execution, and it's all just kind of running, and they got good margins. You might get a 5x multiple on your SDE if you're really good. I've heard even higher at different times. So it's a pretty big range, and that is a significant number. So again, you think about your SDEs, maybe 100,000, let's just round numbers, $100,000. You could either make $100,000 or $500,000 for your business, depending on where you fall in that range. And that's a big deal. So I think it is, like, to your point, Tony, a big thing to think about. Another thing I'll say about that and ask you your opinion is, like, if your business just doesn't lend itself well to being like something you can hand off to other people, how do you start solving that problem? Like, for example, I imagine a lot of your developers that are highly skilled, specialized people that start a development agency that does work for clients, like their skills sometimes are the key thing, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, this is where I say it's so important that we understand that our marketing and our marketing foundation, right? Because, like, part of the reason, if we're honest, the real reason why these agency owners have to maintain such I am the special sauce that makes this agency run, is because at the end of the day, they really, what's masquerading is their competence, which is very high. And what it is they just have a lack of clarity on what exactly it is that they do. right? And so because they're so adept at adapting to different situations, what ends up happening is they just keep on coming back to square one multiple times, every single time. Every single engagement is a new thing.
Sometimes that's fun too. And this is the trap I see a lot. Again, I'm a developer. Like, I get it. Like, it is way more fun to me to solve 10 different problems in a year than to solve one single problem 100 times in the course of a decade, right? Like, I want to just do a different engagement every time because I think it's more fun and creative and I get to like learn new domains. But that is not really a good repeatable agency, right?
100%. Well, and that's just, I mean, like I experienced that in my own, my own firm. Is it's like there's this fine balance of we as entrepreneurs need to be creative and read the room and like adapt as needed. But at some point, you've gotten enough experience and you've seen enough things where you need to start to just plant your flag somewhere. What are my key value deliverables? And then start testing some of those assumptions by start to be a little bit more bullish about some of these things. And part of that is going to look like maybe we're going to start to say no to some potential opportunities. And maybe we're going to build referral networks. So we've got other friends of ours that we know do that work just fine. So I'm just thinking like a web dev agency, for example. Web dev agency, a very creative founder is getting into the space and, they're dabbling a little bit in SEO. They're dabbling a little bit in design. But really the core competency of the agency is development of the WordPress sites, whatever it is. If they really want this thing to grow in a way that it can be owner independent, they've got to find their people that they can refer. Hey, here's the SEO person for you, or here's the designer you want to work with, and finding some of those things to start offloading.
Totally. Yeah. I've met specialized agency owners that make $100,000 a year plus on just referrals, just like being the sort of central person who knows the 5 or 6 or 10 other agencies that work in related spaces, and just being able to say, hey, here's a reliable intro to somebody who will do it. Tony, so you know a lot about agencies. You seem like a sharp guy. How did you start yours? And give me a little more of the founding story. Like, how'd you get into it? How long have you been doing it?
Yeah, great question. So I have been in the accounting and finance world for over a decade. But a lot of my experience was kind of popping around to different places in corporate America. I never really specialized in a particular industry while I was in corporate. But one of the things I think that was a continual through line was this core of like technology and software. I never was in Silicon Valley or whatever. I'm up in the Midwest. I'm in Minnesota. But I always loved the work I did with developers, right? Software developers. And one year, this is during COVID, I'm listening to all these podcasts of like, gotta go out and do your thing, financial independence, blah, 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 all this stuff. And I'm just like, I'm feeling it, right? Like, I'm just stoked. I'm like, let's go make something. Let's do something. I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur. Like, I knew that even before I came into corporate America. I knew I was going to do something entrepreneurial. And then my one friend, who they're still a client today, taps me on the shoulder. He's like, hey, I need some help with my books. What if you come and just help us out, kind of backfill for this? And I was like, okay. And so that it was just an opportunity, right? It just presented itself. I was already working full time, but went and worked with him for a little bit. But decided to take the leap pretty shortly after that. I had our first daughter. And the story goes, I'm like holding this little baby in the middle of the night. And I'm just thinking, I mean, you've got kids, you look at these little munchkins and you're just like, you can do anything you put your mind to. And then I'm feeling like so hypocritical. I'm like, here, I tell her that, but then I'm going to like put my dreams on the side. I'm like, no, even if I fail, I'm just going to give this a go. So that was back in 2021. This is a little over 3 years ago. And yeah, I took the leap, and I haven't looked back since.
Yeah. I started Draft.dev, my first business, right after my first son was born, and it was 2020. So I have a lot of overlap in mentality. I think we're probably, having similar wavelengths. I think I have a suspicion, and I don't have any data to confirm this. So I love suspicions like this because you can't confirm or deny it. That there's something about fatherhood that sort of unlocks this, like, I don't want to call it a risk tolerance, but maybe a realization that the world is bigger than just my own insecurities that allows, or I'll just speak for myself, that allowed me to kind of say, oh yeah, I want to go take that leap. And part of it too, again, was like COVID was a weird time and like nobody knew where the world was going. So like that also plays a part for sure. And it's like, everything's uncertain. So what the hell, let's, jump out there and start a company. But I do think there's something to this, like fatherhood and entrepreneurship, like being linked together for us. Maybe it's like our need to create something. Our wife just created this life and we can't do anything. Like, what do we do? I don't know. But I have no idea what that is, Tony, but maybe there's something there.
I think there is. You think about I'd never really thought about legacy until having kids. And then I'm like, and it's not even like a legacy in like a look how great I am. Like look at my name. It's a legacy of like I even just think about not even financial legacy, but like values legacy. Like there's a couple things right now in parenting that I'm like, man, I'm starting to see them like pick up on some of my bad habits. And I'm like, oh, I don't want that. And so I think it's in that same vein of like, I want my kids to be blessed in the manner in which they see me live my life. Right. And like, I want them, even if they like fall flat on their faces with building businesses or doing anything in that vein, I want them to see like, wow, dad took a risk and I can take a risk too. So yeah, I very much echo that sentiment.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really good way to think about it, and maybe there is something there for me too. Again, this is all unconscious. I don't feel like I thought about it. It just is now. I'm like kind of retconning it. I wanted to ask you about your podcast. I am a relatively new podcaster. So I'm only 10-ish episodes in. I think we've got published maybe right as we're recording this. We probably got another 5 or 10 on the backlog. So we're rolling. What have you learned in running a podcast? And tell us your podcast as well.
Yes. So my podcast is the Dev Launch Podcast. Originally, the reason it was called the Dev Launch Podcast is because we were super niched into we wanted to have guests on the show that were software developers or people doing stuff in the tech scene. We've since branched out and we are now doing digital agencies more broadly, just kind of getting a little bit more of a smattering. That being said, the Dev Launch Podcast was born out of I love having conversations with people. This is like great. I'm a big fan of that. And there's something about a podcast that gives purpose and intentionality to connection. I don't know, you probably have experienced this and many of our listeners probably have too. I certainly have had my fair share of well-intentioned people reaching out on LinkedIn. And I'm just like inundated with life right now. And the last thing I want to do is hey, let's catch up with a random stranger for 30 minutes or 45 minutes. I can't do that, right? I need to have purpose. Like, why am I getting together? And so I recognize that because, I practice what I preach. If I tell my clients, you guys need to practice outbound, you know what? I do outbound too. I do LinkedIn conversational prospecting. So I have conversations with people on LinkedIn. And this was kind of an evolution. What started with I'm trying, the basis level of LinkedIn conversational prospecting. I realized I needed to have a value proposition for our connection. And so it was a shoe in to say, why don't you come on my podcast? Oh, and by the way, I'll give you the content. Like you can use that, you can slice and dice it and then, share it on socials because everybody needs marketing collateral. So it's a win for them because they get all that. They can be poised as a thought leader in the space. And then it's a win for me because I get to know them, I get to know their business. And man, has it been an exceptional way to meet clients, to be totally honest with you.
Yeah. I'm biased here because one of the companies I own is a podcast production agency. And so I tell people this all the time, but I'm now practicing what I preach, I guess. But it is a great way legitimately to have conversations with interesting people that might become clients or referral partners or just people you learn about. And honestly, this conversation here, Tony, I got nothing to sell you. You got nothing to sell me. Like, we're just meeting and chatting here. But I always take away some things from these conversations that are ways of thinking I wouldn't have thought about, on my own or in my bubble, or just exposure to new industries, new ideas, new expertise that I don't have. And I think that's incredibly valuable. So even if not many people listen to this, that's okay. The goal is mostly for myself anyway. And I love that idea of intentionality in the conversation. Like I had a reason to say, hey, Tony, you want to talk for an hour?
Yes. Right. And we have enough overlap where it's like, it makes a lot of sense. So a couple other learnings, if I can just like expand on my learnings. So I had season 1 of the podcast. I'm on season 2. I'm going to be entering in season 3. So first season was just like, let's just try it. Let's just see what happens. And I've learned a lot about like questions to ask and questions not to ask, right? Like I thought I was so clever. I was like, so tell me about yourself, or like, opening up the podcast with just this ridiculously open-ended, not very structured. Yeah. So I learned that if people are much more likely to want to listen if there's some nuggets, and some like purpose or direction behind the episode. So like a central theme. So I took a lot of that learning and made season 2 all about like, I want to make this the type of content people actually want to listen to. Season 3 is I want to try this in person. Like I love that we can connect and we live cities apart. But there's something really special, and there's a certain chemistry in-person podcasting that I've seen as a listener and watcher of podcasts. And I'm like, I want to get my hand at that. So we're gonna
Yeah.
try that for season 3.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Kudos. And I'll be looking forward to keeping up with that because I've thought the same thing. Like it'd be really cool to do a round of these interviews in person just as an excuse to get to get out of the house partly, but then also just to flavor it up, our two backgrounds and whatever. It's like, I don't know. I'm sure people are sick of seeing my office over and over. Cool. Well, Tony, my last question that I always ask people is, what are you reading these days? It sounds like you read a fair number of business books. I don't know. What are you reading that is business or non-business related that you recommend or enjoying at the moment?
So this is going to come out of left field, but my wife and I, our family, we are making progress towards moving overseas. So we're currently in Minnesota, but we hope to move overseas, actually even hopefully this year. And so a lot of kind of my own personal time is spent with just wrapping my head around cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural
Where do you want to move? Do you know?
So it'll be in the Middle East. We'll be heading to the Middle East. So
Cool.
very, there's some similarities in culture, but there's actually there's a lot of differences. And
Yeah.
I think just expanding my mind to realize and peel back some of the layers of things that you just take for granted. A great example would be how we are so, as a Western society, we're very time oriented. And so punctuality is super important. Whereas a culture in the Middle East and honestly most of the rest of the world, that's not how they think about things. They don't think about things in that same way. So anyway, I'm learning a lot about that, learning a lot about myself through that. That's kind of what I'm working on right now.
Cool. That's great. Yeah. That's been a really fun exercise that I've had to push myself to as well, because both companies are international, all remote, and we end up with employees all over the world. I will say in the last 15 years of my career, the barriers have gotten much lower for international and cultural sort of norms and understanding. Like it used to be 15-ish years ago when I was entering engineering, there were huge cultural gaps between the engineers I'd work with overseas and in India. And now, again, this is just, sort of anecdotal here, but now the people we hire in India, they get our memes, you know what I mean? They're kind of in the zeitgeist that I'm in, in a way. And so it's gotten a lot easier in some ways to relate to them and to kind of build camaraderie and feel like we're all part of the same team. But there are certainly still differences. There's differences, around the way that authority and, direction is given in certain cultures is just it can be very rigid in some, very loose in others. And some cultures, it's okay to push back on your boss. Some cultures it's not. And it matters that that, right? If you're going to, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with one or the other. You just have to be aware of the context, or else you're going to miss out on a lot of subtlety. So that's good for you, man. That's cool.
Yeah. And I mean, man, it does take a lot of humility, I think, too, to recognize not only to learn some of these other cultures, but to also recognize that there is inherent worth and value and equity in, it's not because we have more money, therefore we are more important, or somehow we are correct. It's just, they're just different manifestations of how we do human.
Yeah. I think this is and this goes beyond just cultural differences. I think anytime you get yourself into this point, or I get myself into this point where I look at something and I'm like, that just seems wrong. I'm like, why do I think that? What in my background tells me that is supposed to be quote unquote wrong in this very black and white sense? Because rarely are things that wrong in a black and white sense. And often, you see somebody make a bad decision and you think, oh, that was dumb. But it's there's a reason they came to that decision, some background information that I might not have. And I don't know. It's always like, I feel like this is an exercise in empathy, but I really try to apply that because I tend to, just like everybody, I like to make rules that are very hard and fast and like I stick in. So
It's almost as if you might be a software engineer.
yeah, that background does not escape me, or I do not escape it. I don't know.
Yeah.
So Tony, this is really fun to chat about everything from keeping your business from going bankrupt to getting more deals and leads, all the way into your background and your cultural explorations. So we've covered a lot of ground. If people want to follow up with you or keep in touch with Accquip, or they want to follow your podcast, obviously the Dev Launch, give us all the info.
So I would say in the past I've posted a lot more to LinkedIn. I've since kind of pivoted my strategy a little bit. I'm going to be really investing heavily in YouTube. So I would say for sure go check me out. Just go to YouTube, type in ACCQUIP. Accquip, you'll find our channel. We post all of our video podcasts on YouTube as well. But you can still follow me. I'll still be posting some excerpts here and there of the podcast on LinkedIn. For sure, connect with me there.
Sounds good, Tony. I really appreciate the time. This was a lot of fun, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
I would love that. That would be great.
All right. Thanks, Tony. Thank you for watching this episode of Retain Trust. If you like this one, give it a thumbs up and subscribe on YouTube. It takes 2 seconds and it helps others find out about the show. And if you have questions or suggestions for a future episode, leave a comment. See you next time.